Good evening, I'm Dennis Ward, and this is Face to Face. Our guest this week is Eriel Deranger. Eriel is a founding member and the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action and a member of the Athabasca Chipewyan First Nation. She has taken her fight for Indigenous and environmental rights around the globe. You could say Eriel was born into this. Her family was forcibly removed from their trapline in order to make way for a uranium mine just prior to her birth. Most recently, Eriel has been front and center in the Reject Tech efforts to halt Teck Resources' Frontier Mine. Federal government is set to decide on the future of the proposed $20 billion project in northern Alberta in February 2020.
If Canada wants real truth and reconciliation, they need to reject the Teck Frontier Mine, and they need to uphold Indigenous rights and take real action on climate.
Eriel, thanks so much for joining. As we just mentioned there and you heard, you were quite literally born into standing up for Indigenous and environmental rights. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, well, thanks for having me here. You know, I kind of make jokes about it sometimes, about how for myself growing up was coming up with chants and making placards for protests was my arts and crafts at home. But really, the reality of it is that as an Indigenous woman coming from a heavy extraction community, this has been something that's been a part of my life forever, since as long as I can remember. The year that I was born in 1979, prior to us moving to Regina, Saskatchewan, my family had been occupying our traditional territory in northern Saskatchewan in an area near Carswell Lake and in between Carswell Lake and Uranium City. And El Dorado, which was a uranium mining company, came in and forcibly removed our family with armed security away from our cabins and out of our traditional territory so that they could further expand uranium mining in our territory. And so I was literally quite born into sort of this opposition to extractivism and the continued colonization of our peoples in our traditional territories.
Your community is literally downstream from the oil sands. What has been the change for the land, the people in your lifetime?
You know, that's like, when I look at it, and I think about my life, and I think about the changes that I've seen in my short lifetime, I think about what it must be like for some of my aunts and uncles, and even my grandmother who just passed away a few years ago. Because for me, what I've seen is this massive change. From when I was a child, I remember the forest being much thicker and dense in between that area, between Fort McMurray and Fort McKay, where we see most of the extraction zone. And I remember the rivers and the streams. I remember playing in the rivers and the streams around Fort McMurray when I was little. I remember going swimming in the lakes near Fort McKay and drinking water when we would go out into the bush. We'd collect our water in the bush and bring it back to camp and boil it and drink it. And since that time as a child, between the ages of, as early as I can remember till about 9, 10 years old, that's when the shifts really started changing and happening in the region. And we saw the, Syncrude and Suncor getting bigger. And my parents separated, and I spent a lot of time in southern Saskatchewan, and then I went back up into my territory in my early 20s. And the changes were so immense that it was like a shock to my system. That drive from Fort McMurray to Fort McKay was so shocking for me that I remember that drive. One of my aunts, she was talking about, oh my God, you haven't seen it, you got to see how big it is now. And we drove that strip, and I was sitting in the back seat of the car, and she was just talking about how they've gotten so big over the years, and suddenly there were no tree lines anymore. The tree line just stops, and it became so abrupt. And the Syncrude and Suncor facilities had become so immense and so big. And there was a sort of tailings reclamation process happening, and it was just massive white sand and just billowing smokes and those propane cannons going off. And as she's talking, I remember sitting in the back seat of the car and just being like, not being able to breathe, feeling like my ears just started ringing and tears started coming down my face as she just talked like it was nothing, because she had been so desensitized from it, from watching it happen over time. But those memories of my life as a child, those memories of the dense forests and all the different songbirds and even the mosquitoes and the different types of bugs, all of that was completely absent from that area. And it was really, really quite devastating from just that point of view. But then you go into the community, and the changes of the way in which people felt about themselves was also really, really visible. A lot of spiritual and emotional well-being of our community has been deeply impacted by the fact that our lands and territories are being eviscerated by this industry.
We mentioned, you're born into this. You do a lot of speaking all over the globe. Has it been was it a difficult decision for you to decide to be this voice, to speak up?
I would say yes. I didn't really want to do it, and I really struggled with how to do it well. And I remember having this conversation with Chief Alan Adam one time, and he said, well, you have to do this. And I said, what do you mean I have to do it? He's like, well, you're the one that knows how to speak. You can say, you know how to speak. People listen to you when you talk. And I was like, okay, well, I don't know if I feel like I want to do this. It feels like there's a target on my head. It feels like it puts me in a vulnerable position. And he said, but it's your calling. It's what you're supposed to do. And I sat with that for a long time. And my name, Eriel Tchekwie, in Dene means Thunder Woman. And I sat with my name for a while. And I realized that thunder is the sound that comes from the action when we see lightning. And it carries the sound further than the action itself. And I've realized that I've actually leaned into my namesake as a Dene woman, as a thunder woman, as a thunder being. I'm carrying the sound of the actions further than you can see. So I feel like that's my job and my role and my responsibility. And it's not always fun, it's not always easy, but it is what I do.
What have you faced backlash, not only from your own community, but from others around the world?
Yeah, of course, it does put a target on your head. I've had backlash in my own community. I've had backlash directly in my own family. Mm-hmm. I've had backlash from, obviously the oil and gas sector, pro-capitalists, people that think that Indigenous people need to get over it and join the rest of society. I've kind of had it from all sorts of different angles, but I've also had a lot of really great supporters.
How do you, personally handle that backlash?
I think it's surrounding myself with people that I know and I love and I trust, and really taking time for myself and reminding myself that, who I am as an Indigenous woman, my roles and responsibilities and what I'm supposed to do for my community, and always making sure that I have accountability and checks and balances with people in my family and in my community.
There's been quite a bit of reporting recently on the RCMP watch lists and all of this. How likely is it, do you think, that you're among those on that list?
I don't doubt that I'm on those lists. I remember when I was younger doing youth work, someone once said to me, I was just doing youth work, and this government person at Heritage Canada said, the government's watching you. And I said, what do you mean watching me? And he's like, we just like to watch certain people and the work that they're doing. And then it was probably for positives. Mm-hmm. Now I think that maybe I've moved from one column to another column, but I don't doubt that I'm on that list.
As we shoot this episode, the camps, the Wet'suwet'en camps, are being raided by the RCMP. What are your thoughts on what's unfolding there right now?
I think it's really, really unfortunate. It's 2020. It's been 13 years since the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People has been passed. Canada became a signatory in 2012. And there's been movement to look at the implementation of the United Nations Declaration in Canada, both provincially in British Columbia, but nationally there's been a legislative bill looked at and sort of passed in the House, and looking at how we're going to implement the unique rights of Indigenous peoples. And yet when Indigenous peoples assert their sovereignty, their self-determination, and Indigenous traditional laws and governance, it's not respected or upheld. We've seen that assertion of those traditional rights and laws by the Wet'suwet'en clans, and Canada is completely siding with the corporations rather than with the traditional rights holders. And it's really just another indication that Canada has no interest in actually upholding the rights of our communities.
Well, there's a lot going on in the background of this as well, with the legal victory, I guess, for the Trans Mountain Pipeline and a decision coming up on Teck's Frontier Mine, and we're going to get to those. But first, we just have to take a quick break here on Face to Face, and then we'll continue our conversation with Eriel Deranger. Stick around. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Eriel Deranger, the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. And Eriel, this past week, the Trans Mountain Pipeline expansion cleared another legal hurdle. Do you think this pipeline's eventually going to go through?
I think that Canada is going to try its damnedest to make sure that it does get through, only because of the huge financial investments and the sort of political capital they've put behind building it. I don't think it'll be built or approved without a huge fight from the Indigenous communities, and I think that that fight is going to put the financial assets that the government has invested in it at risk. I think that it's really, really challenging time for the government to be looking at building a massive oil pipeline when we're talking about addressing the global climate crisis and phasing out of things like dirty fossil fuels.
The talk almost immediately after the legal hurdle was cleared was of civil disobedience. What do you think this is going to look like?
You know, I think that the communities, the Coast Salish communities that have been sort of at the forefronts of the legal challenges and the appeals of the approval of this project are very serious. I know them very well. They don't want this project built for the same reason that so many communities don't want to see the expansion of Alberta's oil sands or the expansion of liquid natural gas, is these oil projects, these oil and gas projects are threatening not just the survival of our communities, but they're threatening the ecosystems and the places that we rely on. And essentially, these are the places that everyone on the planet is going to rely on. And when we talk about civil disobedience, they're real. You know, we've seen different types of occupations. We've seen what's going on in Wet'suwet'en. We have a history of Indigenous peoples occupying and enacting civil disobedience. But I think what we need to think about is who is actually enacting this civil disobedience? Who is setting the laws and governance? It's the colonial state, and it's Indigenous peoples that are trying to assert their Indigenous rights and laws and governance, including the Tsleil-Waututh people, including the Wet'suwet'en people, including the many Indigenous communities that have stood up against these extractive industries.
You live in Alberta. I'd like to get your thoughts on the so-called Jason Kenney's War Room or the Canadian Energy Centre and what it's doing.
I think it is such a waste of resources to take $30 million out of the public sector and put it into a war room to fight those that are threatening Alberta's economy. Alberta's economy is threatened because it is an antiquated system that we no longer should be pushing and moving forward. The fact of the matter is other sectors are struggling so that Jason Kenney can sort of position himself as a powerhouse against environmentalists, and it just seems absolutely counterintuitive to what we should be doing. We should be investing those dollars in the public sector to ensure that we can create a just transition for Alberta that's going to create stability for our economy and for the people.
Part of that $30 million is for a so-called, or for a public inquiry into so-called foreign funding of anti-energy campaigns. What do you make of that?
Oh my God. So these anti-energy, foreign-funded radicals, as they've been called in the past, like, let's be real. Alberta's entire economy is funded by foreign interests. We have multinational corporations from all over the world that are dumping billions of dollars into Alberta and the national economy. The foreign-funded radicals that we should be looking at are the oil and gas sector. They're the ones that are wreaking havoc on the ecosystems, the rights of Indigenous communities, and ultimately destabilizing an economy for future generations. We need to be looking at what it means to have a just transition, not looking at an inquiry into foreign-funded environmental groups. It just seems completely counterintuitive to what we should be doing.
Is this some big conspiracy, though, that tides and celebrities are funding all of these actions here?
Absolutely, it's a conspiracy. I mean, they can look into the money. These are foundations, these are people that are working to uphold justice. A lot of the funding that comes into the province, particularly to a lot of these environmental groups, is to look at things like transportation, Indigenous rights issues, human health issues. This isn't to destabilize the oil and gas economy or Jason Kenney and his government. These are people looking at human rights and Indigenous rights and environmental justice in the province. They're not here to try and take down this industry at all.
People do you receive criticism, though? People see yourself and others at the tops of these organizations going to Madrid and to Washington and to LA, and do you face criticism, backlash on those types of things as well? I mean, sure, I face criticism, but the reality is that we have political leaders that are going to those same conferences. We have people that are fighting for climate justice, like Al Gore and other folks that go to these things. And we have to go to these things because this is where the decisions are being made. This is where we are negotiating the rights of communities, what kinds of policies are going to be put in place for future generations when it comes to climate justice and ensuring that rights and people are included within these structures. I don't think that there's anything wrong with participating in these things. I think we need to have better models. It would be nice to not have to travel all over the place, but when those decisions are being made, we have to show up. And it's been proven time and time again that the more we show up, the more we're able to influence and change those decisions and policies. Are you concerned, or have you already seen it happening with the war room, that it's making things more divisive?
I definitely think it's making things more divisive. People are concerned. Just a couple weeks ago, CBC wanted to come into Alberta to talk to some folks, and people were really hesitant, the environmental groups, to talk to news people because they didn't want to have a bigger target on their head in the province because of these sort of, big Jason Kenney's war room coming down on them, knowing where they live. They didn't want people in the public to know who they even were.
Mm-hmm. Well, there's another big decision to come later this month, and that is on Teck's frontier mine, and we're going to speak about that. We just got to step aside for one more break, and then we'll continue the conversation. We're here on Face to Face with Eriel Deranger, the Executive Director of Indigenous Climate Action. Welcome back to Face to Face. Our guest this week is Eriel Deranger, the Executive Director of the Indigenous Climate Action. And Eriel, a decision is expected almost any time now on Teck Resources' $20 billion frontier mine. What are your concerns with this project?
I think that this project is just taking us in the wrong direction. This is a project that will destroy disturb over 29,000 hectares of land, create up to 6 megatons of greenhouse gas emissions annually, disturb the critical habitat of caribou, wood bison, and the last remaining wild whooping crane on the planet. And it's going to further exacerbate the impacts that are being felt in the region for water withdrawals, water contamination, ecosystems disturbances, and ultimately the human health of many of the communities downstream from these projects. We can't afford another project like this.
Again, the company is saying that there's 7,000 jobs, billions in revenue, and that the 14 Indigenous communities nearby have signed on. What do you make of that?
Well, first off, the 14 Indigenous communities that have signed on, of those 14, only 3 of them are downstream. So let's keep in mind that only 3 are going to ultimately be impacted, and those are the 3 of the last communities that signed on as onto impact benefit agreements. The reality is as far as the 7,000 jobs, they don't even know if this project's going to go online because of the fact that economically it's not even that viable right now. Even if they were to get an approval, they don't know when those jobs would even come online. So this is a sort of an empty promise of a job and an economic potential for the province that actually has more risks than it has benefits to the region.
The feds and companies, not only on this project, but if you look at any other ones, are always quick to tout the Indigenous communities that have signed on. Do feel that some of them have no option but to? Or?
Absolutely. Impact benefit agreements are not enthusiastic yeses to these projects. It's not like these communities are going, oh great, another tar sands project, let's sign on immediately. First off, many of these communities are interveners, bringing up many concerns around these projects within the joint review process. And secondarily, many of these communities have taken these other applications to court through the Alberta Court of Appeals, the Federal Court of Appeals, and even the Supreme Court of Canada. And yet, despite all of our interventions and actions to try and stop the continued expansion of these projects, we see no project in the history of Alberta has ever been denied an approval. So when a company comes up to them and says, hey, here's a new project, they really have to consider and weigh their options. What are their options? Spend potentially millions of dollars fighting a project that's going to get approved anyways, or try to find ways to mitigate it by signing an impact benefit agreement.
There are reports already that the federal government's looking at putting together an aid package for Alberta should this not go ahead, because there is apparently a lot of division within cabinet over this decision. What are your thoughts on this aid package?
I think, to be honest, that the province does need an aid package when it comes to the jobs and the security of the everyday people, but I think it needs to go deeper than that. The reality is that our province has made some huge mistakes in the past by investing so heavily and putting all of our eggs in one basket for this oil and gas industry without looking for future generations and what a just transition out of this economy would look like. I think it's about time that we've seen the government step up and offer something to the people. We don't need any more oil and gas subsidies. This should not be an oil and gas subsidy to the industry. It needs to be to the people and the workers and the communities that have relied on this industry for too long. Our hands have been forced into making these relationships with this industry, and it's time for the government to come in and ensure that the rights of communities are protected and the rights of workers are protected.
The Liberals, as you know, need a win of some kind in Alberta. I was kind of surprised to see that there is this division within cabinet. Is that good news on your behalf, or are you surprised to see that this may not be just a green light?
Well, I am. Finally, let's be real, finally, again, no project has ever been denied, so the reality that they're even debating this is a good sign. I'm a little bit hesitant that we'll see anything positive come out of it. I think there'll be more delays and more debates around it, but that allows us to have more conversations with the public about what it really means. This isn't about 7,000 jobs. This is about locking us into an oil and gas economy and sanctioning and saying that this is okay to continue to erode the rights of communities, and that we must move forward to find real ways to transition Alberta's economy in a safe way.
Well, Eriel, there's no shortage of things going on as we await the decision on the Frontier Mine and what's happening with Coastal GasLink and the Trans Mountain expansion. So we really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your thoughts with us.
Thanks. Thanks for having me. And
that is all the time we do have for today. We're always looking for new guests, so if you have any suggestions, please email us at news@aptn.ca. And of course, this show and all our shows are available as podcasts. You can find those at aptnnews.ca/podcast. Thanks so much for tuning in to Face to Face. I'm Dennis Ward. We'll see you next week.